No doubt a busy time in Utah politics, and we are breaking it all down with Salt Lake Tribune columnist Robert Gehrke. Robert, glad to have you on the show. Thanks so much for being here. Always good to have you with us.
Yeah, nice to join you remotely.
Yeah, kind of a different way of doing business these days. Maybe we'll get back to normal, but for now we have a good setup. So let's get right into the race for governor. This is really a fascinating race. Let's start off with convention. Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox and former House Speaker Greg Hughes coming out. What were your thoughts on how convention played out?
Well, I think going in, obviously the big question was, is Greg Hughes going to make it out? And if he does, will Jeff Birmingham or Amy Winder-Newton surprise people and be one of the other two? I wasn't too surprised to see Greg Hughes make it out. He had put all his chips on making it through convention to get to the primary. I think the one thing that sort of surprised me was that Spencer Cox was as strong as he was. If you look at the history of the conventions, typically these conventions have a more conservative slant to them. If you remember when Mitt Romney ran with the same group of delegates, he finished behind Representative Mike Kennedy and then went on to trounce him in the primary. But they tend to skew more conservative. Gary Herbert's had problems there in the past, and so this didn't seem like it was going to be Spencer Cox's wheelhouse necessarily, but he performed very strong, and so I think that shows that he has some support among the conservative wing of the Republicans. I think on the flip side of that, John Huntsman's performance was pretty poor. He didn't put a lot of effort into it. He got the signatures, so he's going through to the primary, as is Thomas Wright. And so, you know, now we've got a four-person race, possibly five. Jan Garbett's still a little up in the air.
Right.
The judge ruled this week that she could try to get the 19,000 signatures. It doesn't look likely that she'll be able to do that. But so it looks like it's going to be shaping up to these four fairly strong, I mean, very viable and credible candidates going into the June primary.
Okay, a couple things real quick. One, on the Garbett issue, yeah, she's going to have like a 90% verification rate, so that's a really steep hill to climb. You mentioned Governor Gary Herbert kind of struggled with delegates back in 2016. That's kind of the ironic thing because he was running with Spencer Cox at that time. But now that you mention it, the stage is set. Given the four candidates we know are going to be on the primary ballot, convention isn't necessarily, in a race like this, a true reflection of what we're going to see in the primary. So how do you assess the race now moving forward?
Yeah, it's a really poor predictor. And in fact, you know, as I mentioned, the Romney race, the Herbert race, both of them finished behind their challenger. John Curtis finished fifth at the Utah County, at the 3rd District Special Election Convention. So it's not a good predictor of how people perform in the primary. The polls seem to indicate that right now it's Spencer Cox and John Huntsman. They kind of move back and forth depending on what poll, what time it's done. The big question mark is, if those two split this moderate vote, does that provide an avenue for Greg Hughes? And with four viable candidates, you could have a winner come out of this with less than 30%, become the next governor. So I think, you know, I think right now Cox and Huntsman are the two strongest, but you could see Greg Hughes or Thomas Wright come up and pick up all that ground between them and make this a very close race. Right now, I would say it probably favors Cox a little bit just because he performed so strong at the convention. But, you know, it's hard to count out Huntsman.
Yeah, and then you try to factor how this convention thing works in, because as you mentioned, the person who has won convention since the implementation of SB 54, in most cases, has not been the primary winner.
And it goes to the fundamental issue that conventions are a pretty poor reflection of the Republican electorate at large. You know, we've seen this going back many years, and it was one of the arguments for getting rid of the conventions in the first place, is that if you want a Republican candidate that represents Republican voters, then let the Republican voters pick that candidate. So the conventions are somewhat of a distortion, I think, of where the Republican mainstream is, but it remains an important piece, certainly for Greg Hughes, who's now going forward to the primary.
Yeah, as I mentioned, this is just a fascinating race, and it's going to be fun to watch to see how it plays out. Let's move on to another very important issue, COVID-19 and its impact here on the state of Utah. You have been covering this closely every single day. Why has it been so important to you to not only keep up on the numbers, but try to graph out what they mean for us on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of fear, obviously, and much of it very valid fear. What I've been trying to do is provide people the data, provide people some visualization, a graph of the data, and then try to explain to them, put it in a little bit of context, because it's hard to know. Are we rising? Are we falling? We see cases going up, but we hear from our elected leaders that things are getting better. So, you know, I've kind of tried to immerse myself in it to some extent, become an expert to the extent I can, and try to avoid, you know, making my own conclusions or extrapolating, but just trying to provide people with some context that maybe calms the fears, lets them understand where we are and where we're going,
Yeah.
and how they need to respond.
And I appreciate your daily graphs and how that has kind of put that into perspective. But I have to be honest with you, I've had some heartburn over some of the models we've seen. It seems like a lot of those have been based on worst case scenarios, and we continue to see that pushed out. So in your view, how should we look at some of these models that we're having put in front of us on a daily basis?
Yeah, we've heard from all the experts that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. I think what the models showed us initially is based on what we had seen in China, what we'd seen in Italy, what we were seeing in other parts of Europe, was that this could have been very, very bad. Fortunately, and we saw it was very, very bad in New York and somewhat on the West Coast. Fortunately, we were a little bit behind the curve in Utah, and so we were able to implement all these safeguards, these restrictions that have been very painful for a lot of people and caused a huge amount of unemployment, but they've also flattened the curve, as the phrase we've heard over and over. And so I think it would be wrong to say that the models were wrong. Had we not done what we did do, models probably would have been a lot closer. The models still, though, show that we're not at the peak yet, and we're still a few weeks away from the peak, and we still have the potential for a significant number of new cases in the coming weeks.
And you made a point of that, though, too, that when you take a look at some of the models and then the decision that our local leaders have to make, you can kind of see how complicated and challenging this can be.
Yeah, I mean, they're making these decisions in a little bit of an information vacuum because they don't really know. They didn't have at the time they were making the decisions the lessons that we've encountered since then, and they didn't have the adequate testing to really have an idea of where the virus was and how widespread it was. And so they were making these decisions a little bit blind. I think they probably made, frankly, the right decisions in trying to lock things down pretty aggressively and keep a lid on this. And then when you get as more information becomes available, you can start loosening it, as the governor announced that we're going to be doing this week.
Yeah, so the shift now into the stabilization or moderate risk phase, do you think that's the appropriate timing for this?
Well, that's hard to say. As you mentioned, it's a very complicated question. I think they're looking at the right metrics. I think they're looking at the transmission rate, which is down around 1, which means if I get it, I only infect one other person. In Salt Lake County, that I would have infected as many as 6 other people at the beginning of this. It got down to 5 and 4 and 3, and now it's 1 to 1. And at that level, you're going to see a smooth increase in cases, but you're not going to see that big hockey stick curve that we saw or in some of the modeling early on, because it doesn't rip through a population like that. So I think that's an important one. Our hospitalizations are low in Salt Lake County. I heard earlier this week that they had about 52 people in the hospital, which means we've got a lot of room in the hospitals. We've got PPE on the protective equipment that the first responders, those frontline healthcare workers need. So we're in a good situation where we can adapt to this, start backing off a little bit, and then if we see a big spike, which we might, we'll see an increase in cases. That's pretty much guaranteed. Then you can start putting the restrictions back in place as needed. So it's going to be a tightrope act. The governor, I think, had a good analogy when he said it's not flipping a switch, it's a dial. And so we'll turn it up a little, and we can dial it back if we need to.
And he also made a comment about how there's always going to be some type of risk associated with life in making the move to go forward as well.
Yeah, and it's a question of how much risk are people willing to accept. I think, frankly, from my own perspective, I'm going to be a little uncomfortable. I'm still going to be taking the precautions I've been taking. I'm not going to necessarily go rush out and have a dinner at a restaurant, even though I think all of us, after being cooped up, we would like to do that. But I kind of want to give it a little bit of time first. Yeah. I probably will go get a haircut. I'm overdue for a haircut.
Yeah, you and me both right there. and it shows, no doubt about that. Hey, thanks so much for being with us. Where can our viewers connect with you on social media?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter @RobertGehrke, or read my material at sltrib.com.
All right, good to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Great, thanks, Glenn.